Welcome to the After On podcast. I'm your host, Rob Reed, and this is a series of conversations with thinkers, founders, and scientists. Take a little time and stretch out, because these talks are unhurried and meant to bring you to a top percentile understanding of something important. So, whether you're into startups or ideas, a techie or a lit major, take your time, engage your mind, and you'll be glad you did it. Especially this week, when we'll be talking to Rick Doblin, who has been working since the 80s to bring the world a new approach to psychiatric therapy. And after decades of relentlessly amassing evidence and patiently winning over medical regulators worldwide, he seems to be on the cusp of success. This is part 2 of my conversation with Rick. Part 1 went up exactly a week ago. If you haven't heard it yet, you probably want to give it a listen first. It should be positioned adjacent to this episode in your podcast player. If it isn't, you can find it on my website, which is at after-on.com. Or you could probably get away with listening to this part first, with a bit of context that I'll give you in a moment. This is the more storytelling and prognosticating half of my interview with Rick. We talk about his unbelievably long, strange, and wonderful journey through life, as well as the much longer and even stranger history of the molecule that he and his team seem to be on the cusp of getting FDA approval for, along with approval from the top drug regulators in Europe. We will then discuss Rick's forecasts for the intermediate future of this drug and of psychedelic drugs in general. That last sentence may have come as a bit of a surprise to those who are bravely diving straight into part 2 here, so before we start, here is the brief orienting context that I promised you. The organization Rick founded way back in the 80s is called MAPS, and you can find them at maps.org. MAPS employs just under 60 people, many of them research scientists. To date, most of their effort has gone into a treatment protocol to fight post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. The molecule that sits in the center of that protocol has the rare and coveted status of breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA, which is as much of a big deal as it sounds. That compound is methylene dioxymethamphetamine. It often goes by the snappier nickname of MDMA, but is known to its biggest fans as Molly or Ecstasy. You've probably heard of it. And thanks to Rick, it may soon become legal, or more accurately, partly legal, in your very own nation. I hope you now enjoy part 2 of my conversation with Rick Doblin. I saw a video online as I was getting prepared for this interview. I saw a video from 2014.
Yeah.
And in that video, you predicted approval in 2021, which you have done in every single year since then, and you have done everywhere I've seen, and you've just done now. And in my world, the tech industry, I doubt if there's been a single instance, literally going back to Thomas Watson and IBM in the 1920s, of a CEO having a 7-year vision for his or her company and still being on track 5 years later.
And we are currently on track. I would love to accept all that credit for being prescient and all. But the one area that we were wrong on
is the cost.
Well,
by the way, Thomas Watson and everybody else has been wrong on that too. So you're 1 for 2 as opposed to us in the tech industry invariably being 0 for 2.
Yeah.
So it's still 1 for 2. But now you really do understand your cost pretty clearly, having been through phase 1 and phase 2.
Well, so the variables that are going to really impact cost going forward are the rate of recruitment, the rate of retention, and the number of dropouts. So those are the things that can make it take longer and cost more.
You also already have recruited, is it 60 therapists in 14 countries in Europe as well?
Yeah.
So you've really got the engine set up.
Yeah.
And let's talk about now just a quick snapshot of MAPS, the organization. Yeah. Between it and the Public Benefit Corporation, which we'll talk about in a second, how many people total work full-time for MAPS?
At this stage, it's about 55 people.
50 full-timers.
Full-timers, all supported on donations.
100% donations.
And so that's why I travel so much.
You're raising money.
Yeah, it's better to ask people for money in person.
And let's talk about the Public Benefit Corporation, what it is. That's a subset of the 55 people and a relatively recent creation, right?
Yeah, so in 2013, 2014, I realized that there was an obscure provision that President Reagan signed into law that provided incentives for developing drugs that were off patent. So MDMA was invented by Merck in 1912.
Yeah, that's way off patent.
It was a way to evade a competitor's patent. It was one part of a series of drugs in a synthesis to get to an old drug in a different way. So the patents have expired for the composition of matter. 1986, when I started MAPS, another group started for-profit to develop ibogaine into a medicine for opiate addiction, another psychedelic drug. But they got a use patent on that. Nobody had ever thought about that. It was a bunch of LSD dealers who happened to be, a few of them addicted to opiates. They experimented with ibogaine and it helped them through the withdrawal, and then they didn't have the craving anymore.
Very experimental people. So LSD dealers hooked on opiates, tried ibogaine, and holy cow, no longer hooked on opiates.
Yeah.
Let's start a company.
Yeah.
That's so 80s. I love it.
Well, that actually happened in the 60s, but they waited until 86 to start the company, and they decided to start it in a for-profit way. So I saw various of the early researchers start suing each other for intellectual property.
Oh, in the
ibogaine
ibogaine thing.
And I thought, this is a tragedy. So then I contacted their patent attorney and I said, help me develop an anti-patent strategy so nobody could patent any of the uses of MDMA, which basically means that we put all these uses in the public domain. There's no composition of matter patent for MDMA, and there's no use patents for PTSD.
And a use patent would basically be somebody comes along and says, I've come up with a new use case for this old molecule, and therefore I get a long patent on that. That's what the ibogaine people did.
Yeah, exactly.
So you wanted, even if 30 different uses for MDMA end up turning up, nobody gets a monopoly. Yeah.
So then what Reagan signed, and I didn't know about this at the time and only knew about it around 2013, provided for what's called data exclusivity. So what that means is that the phase 3 data and the phase 2 data and all the other safety data that we're generating, that we're going to present to FDA to ask for prescription approval, we have exclusive use of that data. Nobody could use that data to market a generic for 5 years. And the FDA has indicated to us that they are going to require us to do what are called phase 4 studies. So phase 4 studies are after you have permission to market a drug. The FDA still has some questions, but you can do it while you're making money selling the drug. And what we have to do there is pediatric studies. So studies in 12 to 17-year-olds with trauma.
So the FDA is going to require you to give MDMA to 12-year-olds.
Yes, they are.
The FDA is that thing my mom warned me about when I was a child, that there's this ogre out there giving drugs to children. Turns out it's the FDA.
Well, what happens is that most drugs are studied in adults and then are prescribed off-label in kids, and there's no information about how it works.
Okay, that's interesting.
So the FDA is not just us, but they're requiring pretty much everybody, every sponsor, to do studies in adolescents once they're done with adults. The law that Reagan signed gives an extra 6 months of data exclusivity for doing what they call pediatric studies. And just to say, if those work, then we have to go down to 7 to 11-year-olds with trauma, which I think will really work, because one of the things that I presented during my TED Talk very super briefly was about octopuses getting MDMA. So humans and octopuses diverged 250 million years ago.
Yeah, our common ancestor was like a worm, right?
Yeah.
I mean, literally was a worm. You go all the way back on the evolutionary tree.
Yeah.
So that's a completely independently evolved intelligence. That's why cephalopods fascinate me.
Yeah. And so these researchers at Johns Hopkins gave MDMA to octopuses.
As one does.
Turns out that octopuses are asocial animals unless it's mating season. They much prefer to be solitary. Under the influence of MDMA, octopuses are now prosocial.
They start hanging out together.
Hanging out together.
DJing the whole bit.
Dancing with all their 8 arms and all legs. What that suggests to me is that the effect of MDMA, the prosocial effect of MDMA, goes so deep down into our evolutionary history
that it will work with younger people.
Kids. It doesn't require the verbal fluency.
The fully developed prefrontal cortex.
Yeah. So now what it means, though, basically, is we have 6 years of data exclusivity. Now,
and the reason that Reagan signed this was if things go off patent and somebody like you comes along and discovers there might be this really cool use, if we don't give them some years of protection, there's no way they'll ever earn back, enormous costs of doing that research. So you will, in effect, be the central pharmacy for MDMA for at least 6 years.
And in Europe, it's 10 years data exclusivity. So once I learned that MDMA would not automatically be going generic, then I thought, okay, my whole strategy could potentially be changed. Also, now I just turned 65, and I'm trying to think, how does MAPS survive without me? And so I started realizing that we have a story to tell that's different than most nonprofits, because most nonprofits are trying to solve social problems, but they're not trying to make products that will bring them income. So we, as a nonprofit pharmaceutical company, are trying to get drugs approved that we can then sell. So we could choose to sell at our cost and then continually go to donors to give us more money to expand the indications for MDMA, to go into other drugs. But I thought, A better story, and I think this is what helped a bunch of people give us the $28 million, is that if you jumpstart us to get MDMA into a medicine for PTSD, then we have an engine of income that we can use for funding further research. So we're not going to keep coming back to you for more money all the time.
So if you sell MDMA at a profit to insurers, medical providers, et cetera, then you become less dependent and perhaps even entirely independent of funders. And that's what the public benefit corporation is.
Selling MDMA for a profit is not something that can stay inside the nonprofit. And so we needed to create another entity. And we could have created just a regular for-profit company. But I think the profit motive has so warped American healthcare that we have the highest per capita expenses, but our outcomes are way low. And the insurance companies rake off 25, 30% of the money. The for-profit approach leads to exorbitant drug prices that we see pharmaceutical companies raising their prices to the maximum that they can get. So we wanted to not just model a new approach for therapy, which is psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, but we also wanted to model a new approach for marketing drugs. And so the Public Benefit Corp is a modification of capitalism.
And this is a newish phenomenon, isn't it?
Just the last few years.
And it's a legal structure that removes the fiduciary obligation of the officers and board of the company from maximizing profits. People are always like, well, why are companies so driven by profits? There's a lot of answers to that, but a very big one is they are required by law to do that unless they're a public benefit corporation.
Right. And minority shareholders or even majority shareholders in for-profit companies can sue and dump the management if they're not maximizing profit. And that's where you get all these externalities that are offloaded to the public.
Whereas by having a public benefit corporation, the directors of tomorrow could resist any kind of pressure or temptation to say, let's charge $10,000 because we can.
Yeah. So the benefit corporation then maximizes public benefit rather than profit. And also we need to articulate what we think our public benefit is. So we share our protocols, we share all of our research, even the data. Even though we have exclusive use of it to market it, but we don't need to have intellectual property. We don't have non-disclosure agreements. We don't have confidentiality agreements because none of that's necessary. It all can be in the public domain.
So the not-for-profit will own the public benefit corporation 100%.
100%. Yeah.
The public benefit corporation will manufacture and sell the MDMA at some level of profitability. The money that is made from that will go back into the not-for-profit to do more and more research. Now, I'm doing this in sort of reverse chronological order because I think it's very powerful to start with the present. That makes, to me, the history all the more fascinating because it is an astonishingly long road that led here. And actually, let's start with the very beginning of the road, the chemical history. You already mentioned that MDMA was discovered by Merck in 1912. I just need to note, that is the time of President Taft. That is before the start of World War I.
Right. When Merck invented MDMA, it was just one of the drugs on the synthetic pathway to get to another drug.
They wanted to evade a patent on something else.
They did nothing with it until 1927 when they started giving it to animals. This is now near the time their patent's starting to expire. They're wondering, do we have anything here? The animals didn't say, oh, I love my fellow mouse or rat.
They didn't give them to octopuses then.
They didn't give it to octopuses. It looked uninteresting and they abandoned it. The next we hear about it is 26 years later in 1953. And the U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service and the CIA were looking for mind control drugs. And so they tested 8 drugs in animals for toxicity. And MDMA was one of those 8 drugs.
Just for toxicity.
Just for toxicity. It looks like they never gave it to humans, but that research was classified and didn't come out until the early 70s. Then, for some reason that I'm not exactly clear on, in 1959, Merck decides to look at MDMA again. And they do another series of animal studies and again conclude that there's nothing of interest there. So then in the 60s, a drug was developed called MDA, which some people referred to as the miracle drug of America.
That's the 3-letter acronym.
Yeah. It's an incredible drug. It's kind of like an MDMA LSD combination. It's more psychedelic than MDMA, but it has a lot of the heart-opening properties.
And this became a street drug or a therapeutic drug?
A street drug. It also became used in research. There was a dissertation that was done on MDA and 10 neurotic outpatients that showed it was effective. That was done in 1972. But MDA was quite popular during the 60s in the psychedelic using community.
But it just faded out?
Well, in 1970 was this massive backlash against the whole psychedelic community, against psychedelic research, against Timothy Leary, against Ken Kesey. And so Nixon signed into law the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which criminalized all psychedelic drugs. So then what happened was in 76 is when Sasha Shulgin, who was an incredible psychedelic chemist.
Yeah, let's talk about this guy for a moment.
So he worked for Dow. He was a chemist. He developed biodegradable insecticide, and Dow rewarded him and said, you can have a lab and do whatever you want.
And this is roughly what year?
About 64, 65.
Okay, yeah.
So he had had one previous experience with mescaline, which was so spiritual to him that when he had his own lab, he thought, okay, I want to work on psychedelics.
And that was at a time before the stigma, before the backlash.
So he kept going on there for a couple years. And then as the controversy factor grew and as the backlash started to build, Dow wasn't so thrilled by having him do that. And he sort of left and taught at UC Berkeley and set up his own lab at home and kept developing more psychedelics. And with his wife, Anne, they had a group of 12 people. They had kind of a formalized process.
Because this is a scientist.
He's a brilliant scientist. And so he would take the drugs that he would develop himself first.
Like Russian roulette. How would you know what it's going to do?
Yeah, he would generally start low and then work up, and he would be careful. But once he and Anne thought that there was something valuable there, then they would give it to this group of 12 that were constituted as a long-term group of friends and experimenters because Sasha was continually coming up with new drugs.
So wild. And this is like 60s, 70s into the 80s.
Yeah, 70s into the 80s. And so he synthesized MDMA, and he thought this is an incredible drug.
And how many drugs did he develop?
Hundreds. He's developed hundreds and hundreds.
And another one that's well known, didn't he create 2CB?
2CB, yeah. There's a book, TCOL and PCOL.
Yeah, I've heard of these, yeah.
Which he meant, PCOL was first, phenethylamines I have known and loved.
Phenethylamine being a chemical.
The chemical that counts MDMA and other drugs. And TCOL just means tryptamines I've known and loved. And there's hundreds of recipes in there for all the different drugs and how they work and all of that. So in any case, this group of 12 also thought MDMA had incredible potential.
He tried it, his wife tried it, the group of 12 tried it, and they're all like, this is something else.
And then I think it was now 76, 77, they gave it to Leo Zeff. So Leo Zeff was a clinical psychologist with a PhD. He was the leader of the underground psychedelic psychotherapy movement.
Psychotherapy. So Shulgin was the chemist. This was the therapist.
Yeah. So once the crackdown came in 1970 and all psychedelics were criminalized, all the research was shut down. 40,000 patients were subjects in studies, and just incredible, thousands of scientific papers. And most of the therapists that had worked with it gave it up. But there was a small group that decided that they would break the law, willingly suffer the consequences if they couldn't avoid them, but they would provide them to their patients. And so Leo was the leader of this community. He trained other psychiatrists and therapists in how to work with them, and he had a large number of patients himself. But around 75, 76 was now ready to retire. And he'd primarily worked with LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, ibogaine. And so what Sasha did is he said to Leo, there's this new drug that you should try. And he tried MDMA, and he decided that it had such incredible potential therapeutically that he ended up coming out of retirement to work with MDMA. And then he eventually trained large numbers of therapists and psychiatrists in their use of MDMA.
So Sasha Shulgin was the chemist, he was the therapist. And this is why there was a lot of MDMA-assisted therapy going on in the 70s and 80s.
And around 500,000 doses, much of it made at MIT. So why did MDA, to go back to your other question, that's one reason why people would gravitate to MDMA instead of MDA, because it was legal. But then there were other reasons as well, in that the gentleness of MDMA and the ease to integrate the lessons from MDMA give it certain therapeutic advantages, I'd say, over MDA. MDA still has incredible therapeutic potential. It is more in the direction of LSD or psilocybin, and so it's a little bit more difficult for people to manage. You can have more fearful moments with it. And so MDMA replaced MDA in most therapists. And then even when MDMA was criminalized in 1985, and it didn't have that legal advantage over MDA, still people gravitate towards MDMA.
Now, let's touch briefly into your history now. We're going in reverse chronology. You were just at the age where you would have been drafted for Vietnam had you not become a student.
But I decided that the student deferment wasn't something that I would rely on. I felt that for Vietnam, I wasn't a conscientious objector because you have to be a pacifist against all wars. I felt that there's sometimes you have to defend yourself, and if violence is being perpetrated on you, it's okay to respond. Then what I realized was that in the face of what I thought was a massive injustice, there's a lot of different ways that people are cooperating with the system, and that the best approach was not to run away to Canada, not to shoot myself in the foot or pretend I was crazy. That the best way that I could respond was not to register for the draft, not to take the very first step. What I did not realize is that the system was not as omnipotent as I thought it was. And then later, it turned out around 60,000 people never registered for the draft, and nothing absolutely happened.
You were one of the 60,000 non-registrants.
Yeah.
But you did go to college, as it turned out.
Well, but then I dropped out in the middle of my first year. Let's go back just a bit to say that my grandfather came over from Poland in 1920, and a bunch of his relatives never came, and they were killed. And I had a lot of relatives in Israel that have been there since 1904, and so I was just raised on the whole story of the Holocaust, and that was terrifying for me. But I grew up in the height of safety. I had every possible benefit, you could say. So I was in America at the height of American power. I was white. I was the firstborn male child.
What state were you in?
In Illinois.
In Illinois.
Yeah, outside of Chicago. Born in Oak Park. Then we moved to Skokie, where everybody was Jewish. The family tells a story about how when I was 6, they tried to explain to me that the whole world wasn't Jewish. I had the safety from loving parents who were married for 65 years before my dad died. My dad was a doctor, so we had resources. And I think it was that degree of safety and support that helped me take seriously the traumas of the world. First it was the Germans, then it became the Russians in the Cold War and duck and cover, all that, and then it became my own government. And so I was a draft resistor. And I went to college thinking that I would go to jail for not registering.
So student exemption would not have applied to you. You were a scoff registrant.
Yeah. Then there was a moral dilemma once nothing happened. Days go by, months go by, nothing is happening. And so I thought, should I let them know about me so that they would put me in jail? It was right around the time of those kind of questions. I started doing LSD and mescaline.
This is freshman year of college?
Freshman year of college. I was very square in high school. I didn't smoke pot. I didn't date girls. I didn't get in trouble. Good student. We had a house designed by a student of Frank Lloyd Wright's that I grew up in. And the big thing about Frank Lloyd Wright is it's about blending the inside and the outside. And so this was a house that had sliding glass doors as the perimeter around the whole outside.
You didn't throw stones, I hope.
We didn't throw stones, but even more, my bedroom had a sliding glass door. So I could sneak out without my parents knowing.
But you were still such a good kid. You didn't do that throughout high school.
I didn't.
Never occurred to you.
I had nowhere to go. What a waste. I mean, I didn't want to, like Lynn, my wife, she told me about sneaking out second-story windows where she was growing up. So I'm now at college, and a big factor for me was the moon launch. And then the pictures of the Earth
the
from
Stuart
moon.
Brand's Whole Earth movie.
And actually, it was the Whole Earth catalog where I read a review of a book by John Lilly, and it was called Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer.
And tell people who John Lilly is.
John Lilly,
the dolphin guy, right?
Yeah, he's the dolphin guy, but he also invented flotation tanks. And he was in the 50s, was supported by the Navy to do research with LSD in the tank.
Oh, wow.
And so programming and metaprogramming in the human biocomputer is about his LSD experiments in sensory deprivation environments.
You saw that book reviewed in Whole Earth Catalog, and then you got it.
And then I got it. So I started experimenting with LSD and mescaline.
You do have to describe your college, because it was a pretty wild place.
Is absolutely incredible. So in high school, I was starting to really feel like, the whole system was going crazy. And I got something in the mail from New College. It was an experimental college that had started in 65, and it was an alternative approach to education. And what they said was, in the last analysis, the student's curiosity is the most important thing. So there was no required courses. You could major in things, and there were requirements for the major, but you could have a general studies. It was a small school at the time, only 300 people.
300 students, and not in a class, the whole school?
The whole school. The campus was designed by I.M. Pei, the architect.
Really?
It was right on Sarasota Bay.
Wow.
It was designed to turn into a motel if the college failed.
I don't think of I.M. Pei as being a motel designer exactly.
There was no grades. It was all written evaluations. Heavy emphasis on independent study projects. So I got this thing in the mail, and I'm like, wow, this is really where I want to go. I can follow whatever I'm interested in. Two things that they did not put in the brochure that turned out to be very important in my personal education. They had a tradition of all-night parties with people doing psychedelics.
So this is like the first raves. Didn't happen in the 80s. They happened in the early 70s.
They did. They really did. So in addition to having these all-night parties with psychedelics with some very brilliant students and a tradition of people doing their own individual explorations, it turned out that there was an Olympic-sized swimming pool with a big deck around it and fence around it. And somehow or other, this evolved into a nudist colony.
Now, when you say nudist colony, I'm hoping that it was only the college students and not any creep who was coming down I-95 who wanted to drop in.
No, it was the faculty.
Yeah. So it was the community of the school.
Yeah.
So the college that you go to as this very, very nerdy 18-year-old turns out to have all night long acid parties and a very large nude area.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was just this incredible environment of exploration. And the campus police, their job was to protect us from the real police because it was a private school and it was a conservative area. What it seemed to me was, in a crazy world, it was an oasis of sanity. And it was bringing these energies up from the underground that had been suppressed in all different ways. But we talked earlier at the very beginning about the person that had the gorilla that he kept away inside himself, the warrior part of him, that when you repress these things, they come out in warped ways. They don't go away. They're human energies, so that repression tends to warp and distort. But in a way, it felt like we were trying to go towards a new sort of sanity in an insane world. But I was unable to handle my psychedelic experiences. They were too powerful for me. I wasn't emotionally
Do you have bad trips
fluent.
or?
Yeah. What we say in our work with MAPS is that difficult is not the same as bad.
Right. You'd mentioned that earlier.
What makes it bad is when you resist it. So I had experiences that got to be so frightening that I resisted it. So I would say bad trips. So the worst one was LSD does this ego dissolution, but you can fight against it. So I was fighting against it and scared to let go. But I was having such a difficult, bad time because of myself. So it was my fault. So in addition to being scared of letting go, I was keeping myself away from a deeper knowledge, from full mystical experiences. So then I could start hating myself for being weak and not having the courage to let go. And then I would just get stuck.
You said I would get, so that happened more than once, it sounds like.
Yes. What happened was I would do pretty well, actually, during the first parts of this LSD experience, even sailing through sometimes the peak. But then near the end, it would get really, really difficult.
And you kept trying, it sounds like.
So I kept trying. And
that's pretty gutsy.
Well, I felt like it's a crazy world and people are dying right and left. And I felt like the backlash was that there was some flaws from the psychedelic community, too. It wasn't like we were pure angels and the system came and, knocked us down. There was egotism, there was sexism, there's elitism. If we've done the drug, we're smarter than you. And there was all these problems I felt that we had to work through and I had to work through. And so I would get to these difficult places and I would resist. And then a week or so later, I would try again. And so the place where I resisted, where it was too hard, kept moving up from near the end of the trip to closer and closer to the beginnings of the trip, which meant I had longer periods of time in these horrible states. So this one experience, I ended up being too frightened and just resisting. And I started imagining that my brain was like an electric wire. There's a current going through, but it wasn't going through. It was being blocked. So my brain, by resisting, was actually starting to melt. And then I actually started having this nasal drip that was this dripping into my throat. And I was like,
that's lousy timing. There go my brains.
I was like, my brain is melting through my head because of this tension. But out of this desperation, I went to the guidance counselor at college and I said, I need help with my psychedelic experiences. And it was a time where they took those kind of things seriously. And the guidance counselor was, here's some ideas and here's a book that you might want to read. And the book was a manuscript copy before it was even published of Realms of the Human Unconscious by Stan Grof. That was the turning point of my whole life.
Was that a seminal book to the psychedelic movement in general or more to you personally? Both. Okay, so tell us about the book.
Stan had been a psychiatrist in the Czech Republic. So he was born in 1931. He went through World War II, and then he became a psychiatrist.
Under the communists.
Under the communists. So he was under the Nazis, then he was under the communists.
Boy, that's a winning hand.
And then Albert Hofmann invented LSD for Sandoz. First off, Albert's friends, his bosses, they couldn't believe it because no drug had ever been discovered that was so powerful in such minute amounts. But they verified that it really was. And then Sandoz started sending it around to various research places. They had this drug. They said it's like a voyage into temporary insanity. and it can be useful for the training of psychiatrists, but also maybe it has therapeutic potential. So they sent it to a team of researchers in Prague where Stan happened to be going through his medical residency.
So even with the Iron Curtain, that's very interesting. This Western country was even sending it into Warsaw Pact countries.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah. And so then Stan started having these early LSD experiences. And then they really started becoming one of the major centers of the world to study LSD. They began studying it in alcoholics, heroin addicts, psychotics, schizophrenics. And so Stan then became one of the world's experts on LSD. And then when the Russians came in to the Czech Republic in 1968, Stan escaped and came to Johns Hopkins. And then he helped co-lead their work with LSD. He was actually still at Hopkins when he wrote the book. So I got it in 1972.
And what was it called again?
It was called Realms of the Human Unconscious, Observations from LSD Research. Stan had developed what he called the Cartography of the Unconscious. By that point, he had spent about 8 years, if you want to count up the days, 8 years sitting with people with LSD.
Wow.
So thousands and thousands of people that he had seen. And he developed this whole sense of the cartography of the human unconscious. And what his book was about, essentially 3 main areas. One he called Freudian. It's about what happens to you in your life. That's where you get traumatized a lot of times. And there was a stage called Otto Rank, the Rankian stage. So Otto Rank was a Freudian who said that birth trauma matters. The whole process of birth and the intrauterine stage can impact us in all different ways. And Stan saw a lot of people reliving their birth or talking about birth trauma. And then his third area was the Jungian, where you go beyond your ego into transpersonal things that all humans deal with, and archetypal realms, near-death rebirth experiences, shamanistic dismembering and remembering. So those were the 3 main areas, the Freudian area, the birth, and then the transpersonal. And so reading this book, it finally came to me that this was science, which I trusted, looking at spirituality, which was becoming more and more essential to me, but separating it out from religion, which I didn't trust, which I felt was dogmatic and culture-bound. I felt that also that this mystical sense of connection had profound political implications. And that I thought was the real story of the 60s. Was that people went beyond their ego, beyond their identification, and were able to see their commonality with groups and peoples that were different from them. So why would we want to kill the Vietnamese? Are they really all evil against us? Or for me, the fundamental problem was the Holocaust and the dehumanization. And so if you can dehumanize others, it's easier to kill them. But if you have this experience that we're all in it together, then that will make it so that you have more compassion and empathy. And at the same time, there was this whole concern about pollution and the Silent Spring and the early stirrings of the environmental movement. And so if you feel that you're part of all life, if you're part of the earth, if you're part of the insects, if everything's in one big system, then it's harder to trash the environment too. So I think what happened in the 60s is a lot of people got inspired by these experiences that helped them identify with other groups, and then they started challenging the status quo. And that's what led to Nixon saying Leary was the most dangerous man in America. So I felt like the core problem is separation and identification in partial groups, like it's my tribe against other tribes, or my race, or my gender, or my religion, or nation, all those things. And that the most important thing I could do was to help myself and others have this experience, this unitive experience, from which all sorts of positive political developments will come. And so I saw Stan Grof studying that, but not from a religious perspective, but it was science looking at spirituality, looking at mysticism. But then the final thing was that it was used in therapy to help people get better. So I felt that that was the reality check. So many people would go into meditation or mysticism and get lost in it. And where do you come back and try to help other people? It becomes kind of a self-centered selflessness, you could say. Seeing how Stan wrapped science and spirituality and therapy with a psychedelic catalyst, and seeing the political implications, and then also feeling like this was the political solution. I'm not a mathematician, but nested hierarchies. And so the idea is that certain things radiate out into other levels. And so if you have to do one thing in your life, where is your highest point of leverage? And so I thought my highest point of leverage is becoming an underground psychedelic therapist, working with my own psychedelic experiences, and then trying to bring back psychedelic research.
Because it had already been banned in 72.
Been banned by 70 is when it...
Just been banned.
Yeah.
You became attuned to your life's work at 18. They had just turned the spigot off just 2 years before.
Yes. And so I wrote to Stan Groff and I said, I just loved your book. And are there any opportunities for me? And he wrote me back. Again, shocking. I was just, at this point, 18-year-old freshman in college.
Yeah.
And this MD, PhD is writing me back. And then he said that he was doing a workshop that summer and I could go see it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I attended a workshop with Stan and I did a 3-week primal therapy intensive and I did a month-long encounter group. So I decided I'm going to drop out of college, that I'm way overdeveloped intellectually, underdeveloped emotionally. The world's like that. We have technology we don't know how to handle. Einstein said our technology has exceeded our humanity. So I felt like focusing on that part for me. And also I had all these difficult experiences. So I dropped out of college, then did all this traveling around and doing the deepest techniques that I was aware of. But in the end, I didn't end up where I wanted to be psychologically, spiritually. And so I undervalued the integration process and assumed that the more you go out and have these experiences, the faster you evolve. And so I had a common delusion. A lot of people in the 60s thought just take more and more drugs and you'll advance faster and faster. It doesn't work that way. Finally, I realized that I was so in my head still that getting physical would be a good thing. So I decided to build a handball court. I was a handball champ in high school. And that really did help me starting to get grounded. And that led into
the physicality of it.
The physicality of it and the repetitive nature of it and the fact that you could see what you were doing. And I became the youngest and dumbest contractor in Florida.
So you became a general contractor?
Yeah. So I ended up in the construction business for 10 years. And during this period of time, tripping every now and again, trying to build up my strength.
Nothing like in college.
Nothing like in college, just occasional trips, usually lower doses. I had this one experience on my 21st birthday. My girlfriend was away in England learning pottery, and so I decided to take LSD by myself. And I was at the end of Dead End Street. I had this tiny little house that I was renting, and I had put on a bunch of albums to listen to music, but I had forgot that I'd put on a bunch of albums.
Like stacked records?
Yeah, stacked records, exactly. And you have very focused attention when you're on psychedelics. So I'm on this big dose of LSD. And I also knew that in Tampa is the McGill Air Force Base, and they have a lot of nuclear bombs there. Underground hangars and all these planes.
I didn't know that. In
Tampa's
Tampa.
Big spot.
Had no idea.
Big spot for military and nuclear weapons. So I put on a bunch of records stacked up, and then one of them ends, and there's silence. And I got so deep into just what I was thinking about that I'd forgotten that I'd put more records on. So then the sound that I hear sounds to me like all of a sudden there's an air raid siren. And I thought, damn, I'm turning 21 and there's this air raid siren going on. And then I thought, this is it.
They're bombing Tampa.
They're bombing Tampa.
They're nuking Tampa.
Yeah. So I thought, what a tragedy. I'm just turning 21. My whole life is in front of me, but now it's over. And so I thought, I've only got a short amount of time to live. And so in rapid succession, I went through mourning. And then I thought, well, I might as well live as much as I can. I've only got a few seconds more to live. I need to live it up. And so what I should do is walk out of the house and walk towards Tampa and just embrace the
Enjoy
bomb.
the view.
Okay, so I get out the front door and I walk down the sidewalk and I'm just thinking how beautiful everything is. Like all the shades of green were so subtle and all the different puffs of clouds and the blue of the sky and the noise of the birds and the noise of the traffic. Because I had to cram a whole lifetime of experience into these just few seconds.
You're living it up.
That I am living it up. I was totally happy. And so I'm halfway down the road to the main road, and then the guitar kicks in and the drums kick in. And
I got to ask, what album was it?
I don't actually remember.
That's a bummer.
And so once I realized that I was a fool and that I wasn't going to die and that I had put on this album, I just had this hilarious laugh at myself. But this combination of LSD with the feeling of impending death created an awareness in me of the multiplicity of the colors and the sounds and how much information is coming to us at any second and how much we narrow it down through a filter to what are our needs, priorities, was just a life-changing experience. So at different stages in my life, this decision that I made at 18 kept getting reinforced.
the psychedelic therapy.
Yes, that this was the direction of my life. So now here I am 65, and I'm just so lucky that this idea that I had at 18 still makes total sense now.
Yeah.
And is starting to make more sense to the world.
So you were a contractor for 10 years, went back to the same school in 82.
Well, I had built houses for some of the faculty.
Oh, okay. So you were still in that
I was still
area.
in Sarasota. What really happened was this gradual evolution of working through my difficult LSD experiences, reading all these books, becoming more knowledgeable about the field, and assuming that it had all been squashed, that the research wasn't happening. And so I didn't really know about the underground therapy movement. So in 82, 10 years after I had dropped out, I went back to the same college, and it turned out that there was a month-long workshop at Esalen offered by Stan Groff called The Mystical Quest. And what my first semester was going to be was developing a curriculum for the whole rest of the time. How do I become a psychedelic therapist? So I thought how great it would be to go out to be with Stan at Esalen for this month and work on developing my curriculum. And so it was during that month of September 1982 that a woman named Debbie Harlow came by and said there's a new drug called Atom. And that was the code name for MDMA.
Yeah, I guess if you switch the letters around. Yeah. Shulgin, a few years before, had synthesized it. The therapist had gotten his hands on it in the mid-70s. So this is 6 or 7 years later. It's definitely penetrating the underground, and it's still legal.
Yeah. But once I learned about it, I came back and did it with my girlfriend. I was just shocked how profound it was. And I thought, I learned about LSD in 72 after the backlash, but now I'm learning about MDMA.
Which is being used in the therapeutic setting.
Being used in therapeutic setting, but I was also told that it was starting to be used as ecstasy. I was informed that there was recreational use.
It was starting to leak out.
It had already begun to leak out. And so this was Nancy Reagan, Just Say No era. And so it was clear that it was doomed. So I thought, what a great opportunity. I like a second chance. I learned about LSD after it was too late. Now I'm learning about MDMA when it's still legal.
This is interesting to me. This is 10 years into your mental and emotional commitment to this path of being a psychedelic therapist. And almost all that period was thinking that door slammed shut. And now all of a sudden this is happening.
There's these meetings at Esalen that are taking place that are organized by Dick Price, who was one of the co-founders of Esalen, to try to figure out how to protect MDMA.
And this was explicitly to protect it from the impending doom that people saw in terms of its legal status.
Yeah.
And this is 83, 84.
This is 83.
Yep.
This is 83 and then 84. And so I got invited to be part of this incredible group of people. Andy Weil was there, Ram Dass was there, Ralph Metzner was there, Terrence McKenna, and about 30 of us at different times. And then we would bring in people from the outside that we wanted to influence. And we had the advantage of a drug that was legal. And we knew there was going to be a crackdown. And so that started getting me more political. And so in the summer of 84, I started a nonprofit, Before Maps. And it was what we used to collect resources to prepare to defend MDMA. And then when DEA moved to criminalize MDMA in the summer of 84, that's where I went to Washington, and you had a 30-day comment period. So we had planned for that, and I demanded a hearing. We had a big DC law firm that was working for us pro bono, and we won the case. The DEA freaked out and criminalized MDMA on an emergency basis.
What was the case? So you sued to keep it legal.
Yeah, so the DEA had to justify why they thought it had high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use, and no currently accepted medical safety under supervision. So those are the criteria for a Schedule I drug. And they had to justify that. And so we sued them because we felt that they couldn't justify that. And we had psychiatrists and psychotherapists.
So they couldn't have had any idea what was coming.
They were shocked.
Did they even know about the therapy?
No.
And there'd been 500,000 doses?
It had been done in a quiet way. So they knew about ecstasy. This whole community, we totally blindsided them. And then the first article that was big media once we asked for this hearing was in Newsweek. And we got Brother David Steindl-Rast, this Roman Catholic monk, mystic, incredible figure. He said that monks spend their entire life to reach this sense of enlightened awareness that you can get from MDMA.
And that was in Newsweek.
That was in Newsweek.
Yeah, in the 80s, Newsweek was a massive, massive pulpit.
Yeah, and then Washington Post did an article. Their article was Rabbi Zalman Schachter comparing MDMA to the Sabbath. So we're giving the DEA major headaches because It's not ecstasy users. It wasn't even really that much of a rave drug at that point.
No, it's still tiny.
Yeah, so all this therapeutic stories and all these people with their credentials. So the DEA freaked out and they emergency scheduled MDMA in 85. And then in 86, the judge said it should be Schedule 3.
Your judge, the one that you were pleading to.
So we won the case, but the DEA rejected the recommendation.
How does the DEA get to tell the courts to take a hike?
The administrative law judges, they're paid for by a separate group, but they're inserted into different federal agencies.
Oh, so this was like a DEA judge making a recommendation as opposed to a judge.
Yes, it's just like a courtroom. It's the same rules. It's the same thing, but they make recommendations. They don't compel.
So the DEA was within their right to ignore the judge's ruling.
Well, they have to justify why. So then once they came up with their bogus justification, why they rejected the recommendation, then we could sue them in the appeals court.
In a court that could compel. And did you lose that? The appeal?
No, we won those twice.
Wait, you won the appeal?
We won twice on the appeal. But the appeals courts tend to tell administrative agencies, you did this wrong, redo it.
Rather than
say, do this
undo
or
it.
that. We're just here to say what you did was wrong or right. And if it was wrong, you got to redo it. So we won twice in the appeals courts. And DEA, on the third time, they finally figured out how to phrase it that they would permanently keep it illegal.
This fascinates me because this was 33 years ago.
Yeah.
And now, here you are, having been saying 2021 since 2014.
Yeah.
Very few people have spent their entire adult life in the service of a singular goal. It's just wild how relentless you've been.
And you can see how amazing it was for me this morning to be meeting with police chiefs about offering MDMA therapy to police with PTSD.
Police. Yeah.
So I have, throughout most of my life, perceived of the police as the predators and I'm the prey. And so to start to be sympathetic with the police, and actually my nephew now is a police officer in Washington, D.C. I feel less prey, but also I've become more sensitive to how difficult their jobs are.
Sure. I mean, you're working with veterans. These guys, in many cases, have seen things that are battle-like and have been traumatized by what they've seen.
Yeah. Well, I would say it's probably even worse to be a police because when you're in war, you're kind of anticipating it. But when you're a police, you see the worst of human behaviors. You see all sorts of people who are killed, not because they're fighting, but they've been victims. I mean, just this morning, talking to these police chiefs, we heard about a 10-year-old child that had hung himself, that they had to cut down one of them, and then a baby that had been murdered that they saw. So this whole effort with this legal case and the resistance of the DEA made me realize that we couldn't protect MDMA through the law, and that the only way we could bring it back was through science, through medicine, through a nonprofit pharmaceutical company. So 86 is when I started MAPS. And then 87 is when I graduated college, and I was trying to get into a clinical psych PhD program. I did get on the short list where it's like 400 people apply for 8 spots or something. So at Duke and at George Washington University, I got to the final cut. And whenever I'd go there, I'd say, I want to do MDMA research. A bunch of people would like it, but a few wouldn't.
Yeah.
And this was at a time when all the research was blocked. Anyway, I was not able to get into any clinical psych PhD program. And I realized that I want to do the science, but the politics is in the way. So that's why I need to study the politics. And then I read an interview in Harper's that was with 3 drug policy experts, and one of them had mentioned our lawsuit against the DEA. And he was at Harvard at the Kennedy School of Government. So I called him and I said, would you be my mentor? I need to study politics of psychedelic research and drug policy. And this guy's name was Mark Kleiman. And he welcomed my call. We had a great talk. He said, if you can get in, I would be glad to be your mentor. And I managed to get accepted to the Kennedy School. So that was the whole switch. And then the arc of my life, as we talked earlier, from being self-identified counterculture drug-using criminal, then realizing that the system helps you fight the system. The system isn't all bad. And then really learning the intricacies of drug policy reform, how the FDA works. And then that's also where I met Lynn, my wife. We were at the Kennedy School together. And she had been religiously motivated social justice activist. And she had been a lobbyist in Washington for the Quakers. She said that prepared her for lost causes, so that they argued against the Reagan military buildup. They argued for social needs.
Well, we went through things in reverse chronology. Yeah. I'd love to close on the future.
Okay, great. If we look at what Big Pharma can do, what we're thinking may be possible is personalized medicine, where they customize for your genetic makeup. Maybe this is the drug that you need. And I hope that they develop all sorts of new psychedelics and new tools for psychotherapy and mysticism and all of this. But I personally think that the key work is the new social structures. So Looking at the future, what we're predicting at this stage is MDMA becomes a medicine in 2021. Psilocybin will probably become a medicine 2021, 2022. Ketamine has just become a medicine for depression. In the end of this year, we're going to be able to use what's called expanded access, the compassionate use. While we do phase 3, people can pay for their own treatment.
Because of this recent legal change.
Yeah.
And that's in 2019.
Yeah.
At a heavy-duty application process.
Well, because it's compassionate use, what it means is that you have to be treatment-resistant PTSD.
You have to be documented.
Yeah. And the way FDA defines treatment-resistant is you have to fail on 2 different medications.
Yep.
So people will have to have treatment-resistant PTSD, but they won't have to have severe PTSD. They could have lower levels of PTSD, and we have to continue phase 3 without interruption or slowing down. And as long as we can do that, we will be able to start setting up these clinics for MDMA, expanded access this year. Already, there's over 100 ketamine clinics in America. And so we are going to establish psychedelic clinics and psychedelic medicine where people will be cross-trained in MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine, eventually LSD, iboga, ayahuasca maybe. And there will be thousands and thousands and thousands of psychedelic clinics established.
And iboga has got very clear anti-addiction properties. Psilocybin is being mainly used for depression now. We obviously know that MDMA. Ayahuasca's also got PTSD and depression potential, correct?
Yeah.
MAPS is a unique organization, but I know that people are pursuing psilocybin and also ibogaine. Yeah.
We're trying to get more involved with ibogaine as well, and we did some ibogaine outcome studies. But the main point is that through the 2020s, we will be establishing all these psychedelic clinics. And what we've learned from the legalization of marijuana is that medicalization precedes legalization, is that people have been fed a distorted picture of the risks and benefits of these drugs with exaggeration of the risks and denial of research of the benefits. And what medicalization does is it changes people's understandings of the risk-benefit ratio, and it demonstrates context in where the benefits clearly outweigh the risks. And as that develops, people start questioning the whole system of prohibition. So 1996 was the first medical marijuana states, Arizona and California. So now 23 years later, and we still don't have federal legalization of marijuana, but we're getting close to that. And Canada has federally legalized marijuana. A bunch of states have, including Massachusetts, California. So I think we'll have federal legalization of marijuana. My current guess is 2025. Because it's the presidential elections where more young people tend to vote, more progressive people come out and vote, and that's where the states really do the move to marijuana legalization.
So the voting will happen in 2024, the legalization in 2025.
Yeah, that's the rough guess. And so it's 2035 that I think psychedelics will be legal in a licensed legalization system. So there was just an article in Chronicle of Philanthropy that was published yesterday about the funders for psychedelics. And it ends up with a quote from me talking about how the broader vision is beyond medicine. It's a fundamental human right for people to explore their consciousness, and that we are going to move to a system of what I call licensed legalization. And so just briefly to explain that, I think alcohol is regulated too loosely. People who drive drunk lose their driver's license, but they still can buy alcohol. And then they buy alcohol and they kill people even though they don't have a driver's license.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. That's kind of nuts when you think about it.
It is.
I mean, they certainly shouldn't be driving, but you're right. They should lose their license to drink if they're doing that.
So I think we should move to a licensed legalization where we have a license to buy drugs as adults. And if you misbehave, you get punished for your misbehavior, but you could lose your license to buy the drugs. Whenever you have a system of licenses, there'll be a black market for those people that don't have licenses, but the price will be higher and the search time will be longer. And so I think we should move to licensed legalization for psychedelics. And these psychedelic clinics then become sites of initiation where you go, just like in driver's license, you have to drive in a car with somebody in the car with you to see if you're qualified or not. I think you should go to one of these centers and you say, I want a psychedelic experience, and you sign up for it. And you have it, and you know what's going on, and you don't have a psychotic break. You pass a little written test that is basic information, and then you can buy the drug on your own. And then if you misbehave, you get punished and you lose your license. So 2035 is when I think we will move to a system of licensed legalization for psychedelics. And I think it'll be illegal for minors unless you have your parents' or guardians' permission. And so I think there'll be a parental override. And so then we become the family values party. So why should the government tell you how to run your family? You should have the authority in your family. And 23 states in America have laws that parents can introduce alcohol to their minor children.
Do they?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Most people don't know that.
I had no idea.
Yeah. So I'm saying there should be a parental override. So I think we have a decade of people seeing proliferation of thousands of psychedelic clinics in the US, the rest of the world. And also we see how legalization of marijuana works out. And then people start saying, this makes sense. And we're already seeing a questioning of mass incarceration, a questioning of the over-reliance on police for drug abuse problems, underinvestment in drug treatment. So there's already being questions of prohibition. And so that's my sense of the future. And then what will also happen in these clinics is that they're not just for patients, but they're also for healthy people to just say, I want spiritual experiences. And so the final bigger picture of this whole thing is that what we're about is mass mental health. And mass mental health means people understanding the spiritual nature of things and understanding that we're all in this together and not having the mental illness of dehumanizing others or scapegoating others. That's the long-term goal that I'm working towards.
All right. Well, if you're on target with 2021, I'm going to sure believe in your 2035 estimate as well. This has been a fantastic conversation in this, again, incredibly cozy and warm house, which is the antithesis of PTSD, as it should be.
Yes.
And I look forward to seeing you this weekend at the Brain Mind Summit.
Yeah.
Which people hearing that are going to think, oh, it's psychedelic. It's like, no, this is actually a neuroscience summit at MIT, which is going to be amazing because I went to the Stanford one a few months ago and that was mind-blowing. Again, great to catch up with you.
Terrific, Rob. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Huge thanks to Rick for his unbelievably generous availability. That interview actually stretched over a long afternoon and deep into an evening, as Rick had to break off a couple of times for work-related urgencies that came up, and it was certainly worth every single minute. Coming up in June, there will be more episodes of this podcast. Plus, I have a big TED Talk coming out. I gave it at TED's main annual conference last month, and as I record this, TED's current plan is to release it on the front page of their site, TED.com, on June 18th, although that date could shift a smidgen for unforeseeable reasons. TED also had me come by their New York City studios to record an audio version of my talk just a few days ago, and this will run as the TED Talks Daily audio podcast on that same day, June 18th. They decided to do this because I integrated a lot of visual elements in the live on-stage version, which of course would be lost in audio, and also there was a certain amount of rather cool audience interaction. So overall, TED worried that podcast listeners would feel left out listening to the live version. Recording a special podcast version of a main stage talk was actually a first for them. Normally, they just wouldn't bother to podcast a highly visual talk like mine. So I hope everyone's pleased with the experiment, and I'm really quite honored to be the guinea pig for it. One last thing. Each summer, I do an annual assessment of the podcast's viability based on my audience's size and also its commitment to my work. I was expecting to do that in late June this year, but it's now looking more likely to happen sometime in July, so in a couple of months. Therefore, if you are at all excited about my work, please let me know somehow. There are countless ways to do this, and virtually all are free and almost effortless. For instance, rating or reviewing the show in your podcasting app of choice will take you moments and won't cost you a dime. Promoting the show or specific episodes of it in social media is also free and almost effortless. And I notice these things. They also help grow the audience. And the larger my audience, the more likely I am to continue. So I'll be paying careful heed to your posts, ratings, reviews, retweets, and or deafening silences over the next couple of months, and we'll see where it all leads. In this context, since it may not be obvious, I'll briefly note that creating each of these episodes takes many dozens of hours, much of it in preparation and research, which is hopefully invisible to you as a listener. But believe me, the work sure happens, and it is not invisible to me. And as often as not, I cross the country or even an ocean to conduct interviews in person, none of which is cheap. Then there's the investments in software, online services, and professional services. Above all, the exquisite work of my editor, Jason. Thank you as always, Jason. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, there's opportunity costs. There are only so many creative hours in the year, and over the past few months, I've been invited to engage in a lot of really cool projects in partnership with fellow creatives whom I truly respect. I say no to most things because of the podcast and its demands. Yet despite that, I've fallen behind on a couple of non-podcast projects that I am really committed to. So I'm pretty much sold out in terms of my creative time. That means there are choices to be made, and if your vote would be for me to continue with this podcast, please cast that vote in some noticeable manner over the next couple of months, and this show could just go on forever, which would suit me fine. I love this work. I'll close by noting that there's also an unfree way that you can support this podcast, and about 1,100 generous people are already doing just that, which is to back it on patreon.com, specifically at patreon.com/Rob Reid, and Reid is spelled R-E-I-D. There I gratefully and shamelessly accept any donation of any size to continue this work, and at a level of $5 per month or more, you'll unlock dozens of hours of lovingly crafted special access audio that I've been stockpiling there for generous backers since February of last year. There are extended versions of quite a few of my now 50 episodes. There's lots of completely freestanding audio essays, I guess you could call them, short bonus interviews, and sometimes patrons get early access. For instance, that was the case with the Rick Doblin interview, which I posted as a combined whole a few days before Part 1 premiered in the main podcast feed. I'm continuing with my Patreon program despite landing my first sponsor back in March, because as regular listeners will know, I'm developing a rather exotic and handcrafted form of sponsorship here. It took me a year and a half to find my first sponsor, and it could easily take that long to find the next one, who knows? So I remain deeply grateful to my community of supporters, which I will continue to nurture as much as I'm able. Thanks so much for listening, and quite a bit more is coming in June.